Hi everyone! Today we're going to have a look at how we can customize Blender in order to make it a little more comfortable and easier to work with. I've been using Blender for about a month now, and I'm coming from Cinema 4D and Moment of Inspiration, and customizing the interface to make it look at least a little bit more familiar was actually a big help for me to get started with Blender. Today we're going to have a look at what we can do in the preferences to customize Blender, and I'm going to record a second video that will show how to create a default start file, because there's many things that I've changed that you can't change in the preferences. You need to change them in Blender's viewport, for example, in various places, and then you have to save a default start file that will open every time you open Blender. So let's jump right into Edit and Preferences. And before we do anything, let's have a look at this button down here, which is the Save and Load button. By default, the Autosave Preferences are switched on, and that means that whenever you make a change, Blender will automatically save it. That is something you probably don't want at this point, so go ahead and switch that off. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't recommend saving anything for now. Just maybe have a look at what I'm changing, and later you can make the changes that you like and save those. Whenever you make a change, you can hit the Save Preferences button, but the thing is, this also applies if you make two changes here and a couple of changes under Themes and Viewport. Whenever you hit Save Preferences, everything that you've changed so far will be saved, and that's probably not something that you want either. Now, if you want to save the changes, I would recommend that you make a list of the changes you make. Like any other 3D software, there's a lot of information you need to process and learn, and nobody remembers everything the first time. So take it from me, I've gone back to the factory default settings a couple of times before I got wiser and finally made a list of the things that I changed. And after that, it was a lot easier to go back and undo certain changes without having to, reset everything and go back to the factory default settings. We're going to start right at the top on the interface tab, and I'm just going to fold everything here. And you can see we have 5 subsections here. The first one is display, and the resolution scale is one of the first things I changed in Blender. By default this is set to 1, and I'm working on a very big screen and this is really very small, so I changed that to 1.3. And you can make changes in these fields simply by clicking on them and then entering a number. Or you can use the arrows on the left and on the right to make those changes. Or you can left click and drag, and this has the advantage that as long as you are still holding down the left mouse button, you can always right click to go back to whatever you entered before, which in my case is 1.3. The line width, I have set that to the default. There also is the option thin, which doesn't really change anything as far as I can see. And we have the option to switch that to thick. Now, this would be my preferred option because you can see this cube here. If I go to edit mode and switch to edge selection, the edges are much more visible. If I switch that to thin or default, you can see it's a lot harder to see them. However, changing the setting to thick affects the entire, it's a global setting that affects the entire interface, and I don't really like these thick grid lines. So I'm keeping this at the default here. The splash screen is switched on by default. I switched that off because I don't want to see it every time I open Blender. You can always access the splash screen by going to this Blender icon in the top left corner here. And if you click on that, you can open the splash screen at any time and then open one of the Blender default scenes or some of your recent files here. So I've switched that off. The user tooltips are switched on by default, and it's probably a good idea to keep those switched on. And what these do is if you hover over anything, Blender will tell you what it is, what it does, and what the shortcut is that you can use to use that tool or command. And that's all I changed here. Now let's go to editors. And here I didn't make a lot of changes. I switched off corner splitting. What corner splitting does is, if I switch that on, corner splitting enables you to create additional viewports. And there's a couple of ways you can do that in Blender. One of them is corner splitting. If you hover your mouse over a corner, you can left click and drag and create a new viewport here. Now, for some reason, I have difficulties changing these back. So you can change them back by going to the corner here and dragging your mouse over to whatever side and join these viewports again. For some reason, that's not always working for me, which is basically just me. It's not because it's not working in Blender, but it's something I'm not comfortable using. So whenever I want to change the viewport and split it into a couple of viewports, I just move my mouse over here and you can see changes to that double arrow. I can right click and do a vertical or horizontal split like this and make the split. Let's do a horizontal split like this. And if you want to reduce the number of viewports again, you can hover your mouse in between two viewports, right click and select join areas, and you can join it, you know, two ways, in this case up or down. And over here I'm going to combine these two like this. So it's an additional way of creating new viewports. Like I said, for me, that's not really working. I've switched that off. And the other thing I changed in the editors is the status bar information. By default, all of that is switched on. And you can see down here in the status bar all of the information that is now being displayed. I find this a little bit difficult to read and not very useful, so I switched that off. And I think the scene statistics is something that you can only see in the status bar in previous versions of Blender. In Blender 2.92, you also have the option to display your scene statistics in the viewport. You can't set this in the preferences. You need to change this in the overlays and then save a default start file for this to show up every time you open Blender. But as far as I know, this was not possible in versions prior to 2.92 or 2.9. So if you want your scene statistics and you're working with Blender 2.8, for example, I'm not sure if you can even switch that on and off in the preferences in Blender 2.8, but I can do that in Blender 2.9. So I don't need all of that information in the status bar. And all I have switched on here is the Blender version, which you can see is 2.92.0. And that's all I changed in the editors. I'm going to skip translation and text rendering. I haven't changed anything there. Now, some of the most helpful changes I made was under menus here. We have two subsections here. One is open on mouse over and one is pie menus. And the default for Blender is this option is switched on. And if you right click on any of these fields, by the way, you can choose to reset the value to the Blender default value. So these two settings define the time it takes for a top level menu and for a sub level menu to open. And for me, this is totally confusing because I'm used to left clicking on a menu to open it from Cinema 4D, so I couldn't really work with that. First, I switched that to a higher number, but eventually I turned this off altogether. So to demonstrate what this does is, right now we have the default Blender settings. If you hover your mouse over a menu, it will open after a certain time that is defined in the preferences, and the same goes for the sub-level menus like this one. And if you work very fast, you could put this down to the minimum, which is 1. So these menus will open really quickly. But for me, this was confusing because whenever I move my mouse over any of these menus, it will open, and it was bothering me. So I switched that off altogether, and now I can hover over a menu. It won't open until I want it to open. It's not true for the sub-level menus, but that really doesn't bother me. So that's one small change that made Blender a lot more usable for me. And the same goes for the pie menus. And in the pie menus, I changed two things. One is the animation timeout. The default is 6, apparently. I'm going to change that to a really high number. One example for a pie menu is the Cursive Pie Menu, and you can open that by hitting Shift and S on the keyboard, and you can see the menu animate. And the higher the number, the longer it takes for this menu to animate. And of course, 100 is way too high. If I reset that to the Blender default and open it, it will animate a lot quicker. But unlike the other menus here, that was still too slow for me, so I changed that to 0 because, you know, whenever I open a Pie menu, I want it to appear on the screen immediately. The tab key timeout was the second thing I changed. If I reset this to the default value, that's 20, and that was still too fast for me. I'm going to change that to 0 just to demonstrate that. When I started using Blender, opening Pie menus was a constant hit and miss for me, and I'm pretty sure that it's just me and the fact that I'm used to using shortcuts differently in Cinema 4D and Moment of Inspiration. But basically what happened to me, if I hit Shift S, the menu would open and then close on me again. I can hold down the S key to keep this open, but this for me is a totally weird way of working. So I changed the tab key timeout to something really high, 100, and doing that made sure that, opening a Pie menu no longer was hit and miss for me. It always opens, it stays open as long as I want it to stay open, and I can left click to exit it again. So that is the two things that I changed in the Pie menus, and that covers the interface. Let's move on to the themes. Themes is all about customizing colors anywhere in the interface, and you can see we have quite a few options here. The only area where I've changed anything is the 3D viewport. So let's go ahead and unfold that. And one thing I've changed is the active object color, and that is the outline of the selected object or the selected objects. I've switched that from the default orange to a bright yellow. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we can find the face orientation back and face orientation front. So these are two things that I changed in the themes. And you don't necessarily want to make those changes. I made those because I'm used to different colors in Cinema 4D. For example, in Cinema 4D, the face orientation back color is blue and the face orientation front color is orange. And in Blender, that's red and blue. I only changed the color for the face orientation back, and I think, but I'm not sure, I think that I changed the alpha to 1. By default, it's 0.5, I think. As for the face orientation front, the only thing I changed is I reduced the alpha to 0 because I don't want to see the color of the faces facing the right direction. Let's have a look at this cube here. You can't really see any colors. If I go to edit mode, by default everything is selected. You can see the color is orange. So that's what I'm used to from Cinema 4D, but this is not the color of the face orientation front in Blender. If I deselect everything, you can't see any colors. And one of the reasons is because in order to see the colors that you define here for face orientation back and face orientation front, you need to go to the overlays and switch on face orientation. And you still don't see anything. And the reason for that is because I have switched off the face orientation front completely. If I go in here and increase the alpha, you can see the color change. Now I don't really need to see that color because all I want is for Blender to show me the polygons that need to be fixed, the polygons or faces that are facing the wrong direction. So if I select one of these faces here, I could go to Mesh and Normals and flip that, and now this face turns blue. And if I deselect it, and it doesn't make a difference if I'm in edit mode and object mode, you can see that one of these faces is now blue. And this is really helpful for me in modeling because I can immediately see which polygons or faces need to be fixed. So I can, in this case, go to edit mode, select this face here and go to Mesh, Normals and flip it. Or I could select everything and then go to Mesh, Normals and recalculate the outside. Now if I delete one of these polygons, you can see on the inside everything's blue, and that's fine because the inside or the back face of a polygon needs to be blue. It's also an indication that in this case everything's okay, because the outside doesn't have any color, which means everything's facing the right way, and the inside is blue. If you scroll down all the way to the end, there's a few more changes that I made here. One is the vertex size. By default that is very small. So if let's just deselect everything. If I go to edit mode, we're already in edit mode here. And if I switch on vertex select, you can see these little dots here that represent the vertices. And I find it much more comfortable to work with Blender with a vertex size that I've set to 8 pixels here. By default, I think it's 3, which is very small. Things are a lot harder to see, so I changed that to 8. And I did the same for the face dot size. I changed that from, let's just check. The default seems to be 1. I've changed that to 6. And right now you can't see the face dots. In order to be able to see them, you need to switch to face mode or face select mode and switch on wireframe. And as soon as you do that, you can see these dots on the faces, and these are the face dots. So I wanted those to be a little bit bigger as well. Let's go back to solid mode. And the last thing I changed, and not the last thing, last but one, is the outline width. And you can only see the outline in object mode. So as soon as you select an object, it has this outline. I already mentioned that I changed the color from orange to yellow. And the width, I think by default is 3, and that's a bit too much for me. I changed that down to 1. The object origin size, if I go to overlays and switch off the 3D cursor, the origin is this small dot here. And this is too small for me, so I changed the object origin to a size of 8 pixels here. Okay, and that covers the themes. Let's move on to viewport. And I've only made a few changes here. One is the gizmo size, and this gizmo size refers to the object gizmo here. Now you may not even use that gizmo. So in that case, you won't need to worry. By default, that gizmo size is, a little bit too big. So I changed that to 60 pixels. And one other thing I changed is the 3D viewport axis, and that is this gizmo up here. The default is interactive navigation. If you're new to Blender, you might find this useful. You can click on the various dots here to go to orthographic views, for example, or left click and drag to rotate your scene. I don't really need that because I'm using shortcuts to navigate the viewport, and therefore I've switched it to simple axis. It's an orientation help for me. I could also use the grid lines here to tell me the orientation, but again, that is something I'm used to from Cinema 4D, so I like the simple axis. And I changed the size. By default it's very small, to the maximum of 64 pixels. And I also changed the brightness, which is 8 by default, and I changed it to the maximum of 10 to make it a little more visible in the viewport. And that is all I changed in the viewport settings. So far I haven't made any changes on the lights tab. I didn't change anything in editing or animation. So let's move on to add-ons. I've made quite a few changes here. In the add-ons section of the preferences, you will find all of the add-ons that come with Blender. And if you've installed free or paid plugins, they will also be listed here. And you can activate and deactivate your add-ons here, and you can install or uninstall add-ons in this section here. Because I do a lot of modeling, I have activated a couple of useful add-ons here that are not activated in Blender by default. And you can look for add-ons in this field here. The first one we're going to look for is the bool tools, and I've already activated this. If you click on this little arrow to unfold the options and information, you can see a description of the tool. You can also see where it's located in the 3D viewport. The bool tools, for example, are located on the Edit tab on the N side toolbar on the right side of the screen. So if I unfold the N panel here, you can see the Edit tab, and if you click on that, you can see that the Bool tools can be found here. Depending on the add-on, you will find it either when you're in object mode or in edit mode, and some of them I think are available in both modes. If I switch to edit mode here, you can see the Bool tools disappear from the edit tab, and there's a couple of other tools in here. We're going to talk about those in a second. The funny thing about the Bool tools is that if you use the N-side panel to perform Boolean operations, Blender will automatically apply the modifiers. So if you prefer to work non-destructively, for example, if I copy this cube and select both of them and do a Boolean difference, you can see here in the outliner, if I unfold the cube, the modifiers are gone. And if I do the same thing using the shortcuts, I just redo that. So if I use the shortcut for Boolean difference, which is Control- on the numpad, you can see that the modifier is still there. That's a bit weird. I wish there was an option to at least choose between, performing a destructive or non-destructive Boolean operation, but that's how it is. And also the information on the add-ons tab here, where you can find that particular add-on in the viewport, does not list the other places where you can find it. For example, the Bool tools are also available under Objects. If you go all the way down, the Bool tools are here. Or you can also use Control-Shift-B, for example, to bring up the Bool tool menu. So I wish this information would be a little more complete, but in this case it just lists the N-side toolbar as the location where you can find the Bool tools in the 3D viewport. Many of these add-ons also have a link to documentation or a link where you can report a bug, and most of them, but not all of them, also have a preferences section. And this is really interesting because that's something I didn't know, and I never saw anyone mention this in the videos I've seen about Blender. Many of these add-ons have these preferences and there's a tab name. And if these add-ons do have that section, there will usually be a default name in there, and that's where you can find that add-on on the N-side toolbar, for example. You can always change that name to anything you want. I could change that to my add-ons, for example, and if I hit enter, Blender will create a new tab on the N-side toolbar, and that's where the Bool tools are now. And this is case sensitive, so if I type edit like this without a capital E, Blender will just create a new tab. So that's something you need to bear in mind when you want to sort your add-ons into certain categories or put them on certain tabs. So let's move on. The next tools we're going to look for are mesh tools. And if I enter mesh here, there's a couple of things I've activated here. One of them is the add mesh extra objects. Once you've activated the extra objects, you will have access to stuff like the single vert, which is quite popular. I've seen people use that a lot in tutorials for creating 2D shapes like cutters for Boolean operations, for example. And again, if you unfold that, you can see the location is under the Add menu and Mesh. This one doesn't have the option to put it on a tab, and like it says in the preferences, you can find those extra tools under Add Mesh, and Single Vert, for example, would be here. The shortcut for bringing up that menu is Shift and A, so that is a faster way of getting to those objects. The next one is the 3D Print Toolbox, and this one will be in the sidebar. It gets its own tab, and for this one you can't define, or you can't create another tab for this one. And this tool is very useful for checking your meshes and cleaning up your meshes. The next one is the Mesh Edit Mesh tools, and these are additional tools for modeling. Again, you get the location here, it's on the sidebar, Edit tab, And this information often also displays in which mode you can use that particular add-on. For example, this one will be available in edit mode. So if I switch from object mode to edit mode, you can see the mesh tools here. They're on the edit tab. And the same goes for the mesh loop tools, which is another add-on that I activated here. And again, these are additional tools for modeling, and you can find them in the under the edit tab on the inside toolbar. And you can also access these by right-clicking in the viewport if you're in edit mode. So you can find the loop tools here, and you can find the mesh tools here. So you don't need to use the inside toolbar if you don't want to. And I've skipped the mesh F2 tools, which I think is the last modeling plugin or add-on that I activated. And this is just an extension of the F tool in Blender. And the F tool lets you create faces, and the F2 add-on just extends the functionality of the F shortcut or tool. And the only way to use that is by using the shortcut F. The last add-on that I activated is for rendering. If you type in render, there is a useful add-on called Auto Tile Size, and what this does is it estimates and sets the tile size that will render the fastest. It's really useful to have that switched on. I would definitely recommend that. And that's all I changed on the Add-ons tab. I haven't changed anything on the Input tab. So let's go ahead and look at the navigation next. On the Navigation tab, I only made 2 small changes. But like some of the other small changes I made in Blender, these ones made a big difference for me and made Blender much easier to use. If you take a look at Orbit and Scan, you have an option to switch on, or rather switch off depth. By default, this is switched on. I don't have a technical explanation for how this works in Blender, so I guess I'll just demonstrate it. So let's say I have this cube here and I move my mouse over here and I rotate the view. Let me just switch that on. What happens is this. It's a totally weird way of rotating in your scene, and it's really easy to get lost in 3D space. So I would definitely recommend to switch depth off. And now, if I do the same thing I did before, you won't get lost. Okay, you can still rotate around this cube here. Depending on how you work, you might also want to switch on Orbit Around Selection. Now, all of these options here work both in Object and Edit mode, and some of you may find it more useful to be able to orbit around a particular selection. So if I switch that on, for example, and if I go to Edit mode and switch on vertices, if I select a vertex here, I can rotate around that vertex here. I don't really like working like that because I want to be able to rotate around wherever my mouse is. If I switch on Orbit Around Selection, I will always orbit around the selected component. So in this case a vertex, but the same goes for edges and faces. But some of you may find this useful. The other change I made is under Zoom, and here I switched on Zoom to mouse position. And this is something I'm also used to from Cinema 4D and Moment of Inspiration. So if I hover my mouse over this corner here and zoom in, Blender will zoom in to this corner. If I hover my mouse over this bottom corner here, I can zoom in to this corner. And that's all I did under Navigation. Let's have a look at Key Maps. Key Maps is kind of a dangerous place to go to because you can screw up a lot of things, and changing a shortcut or adding a shortcut may have an effect on a lot of other shortcuts in Blender. You can define your own shortcuts, but be careful. In the Key Map section here, you can search for functions by name or by key binding. And most of the time I find key binding more useful, especially when I want to add or define a custom shortcut. I usually go to this section here and, for example, type in F2, And Blender will give you a list of all the options that have the F2 key assigned to them as a shortcut. So you can always see whether a shortcut is already being used by Blender, and if you want to change it or overwrite it, I would recommend that you make notes of that, especially if you make a lot of changes, because again, you know, if you're new to Blender and considering the fact that many of these options here are a bit confusing, because a lot of the functions here have exactly the same name, like the view axis. I'll show you that in a second. And the view axis, by the way, is one of the things that I changed here. And you can see that because instead of an X over here on the right, there is this arrow. And you can use that to switch back to the Blender default shortcut if you want to. In many cases, this will be the better way to go back to the original shortcut. You can also use the restore button, but this will restore all of the shortcuts in Blender, and that's probably not what you want, because if you already have a number of custom shortcuts, you don't want to restore everything to the Blender default. And like I said before, you can also search by name, but this is not very helpful in many cases. For example, if I look for view, you can see I get a really long list of view shortcuts here. And for example, I changed some of the settings in the 3D view, and I'm using my own custom shortcuts for certain things in the 3D viewport. But as you can see, many of these options here have exactly the same name, so it's a bit difficult to tell which is which. So in some cases, it is a better idea to try and look for the option you want to change in the viewport. For example, if you go to View and Viewpoint, you get your camera options here. And one of the things I changed is the top, front, and right views. I didn't want to have to relearn those shortcuts in Blender. I wouldn't recommend that you use the same shortcuts I do, because some of them will have an effect on other shortcuts in Blender. But in this case, I didn't want to make a compromise, so I changed them anyway. Now, if you find these options here in the 3D view, you can right-click on an option and you get a couple of things you can do here. For example, change the shortcut or remove the shortcut. And the reason why I wouldn't recommend that you use the same shortcuts is because, for example, F3 is a shortcut that in Blender is used for the menu search. Now, I've assigned a new shortcut for that because it's a very useful option in Blender. It's like the commander in Cinema 4D. So you can look for anything in Blender by bringing this window up. And for example, if you look for extrude, well, you won't find anything here because we're in object mode. But if I go to edit mode and use that search again, I can look for extrude, and Blender will list all of the extrude options that you have in Blender here. So that covers the key map section. Like I said, be careful what you change in Blender. I only changed very few things, just a few basic things that I didn't want to live without in Blender. But other than that, I'm trying to get used to the Blender shortcuts. On the System tab, I didn't really change a lot. The only thing I'm going to mention here is the memory and limits. I have switched the undo steps to the maximum of 256. The default is 32, but the more undo steps you have, the better it is. It doesn't have an effect on Blender's performance, so you might as well switch that to the maximum. And that's all I changed in the preferences to make Blender more usable for me. I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care, and I'll see you again soon.